The Mindset Advantage, a podcast by Arcadia Consulting, architects of change.
The premise of any vision and strategy is that it creates value and outperforms the old way of working, product, market, or business. This demands teams that execute at a peak performing level. It demands agile adaptation to the market, competition, and innovation. In this episode, Andy Wolfe is joined by RAF Group Captain Emma Keith to discuss what it means to be and drive a high-performing team.
Hello and welcome to this next episode of the Mindset Advantage. I'm Andy Wolfe and I'm one of the co-founders and a global partner in Arcadia Consulting. And it's a huge pleasure for me today to be here with Group Captain Emma Keith of the Royal Air Force, the Commandant of the Tedder Academy of Leadership, with whom I'm working very closely for the past 12 months. And it's a great honor to have you here this afternoon. Emma, you're going to talk to us about higher performing teams and how to develop them as a crucial part of the organizational change across the Royal Air Force. But before we do that, Emma, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? And a huge welcome.
Thanks, Andy. It's lovely to be able to join you and to chat. As you said, Group Captain Emma Keith. I joined the Air Force actually over 20 years ago, scarily. And I joined as an operations officer originally. But I rapidly realized I was actually far more interested in people than I was in aircraft. And I originally trained as a mediator, so I got involved in conflict resolution. And from there, my interest in leadership grew, really. And I became qualified in a number of leadership courses, resulting in my master's in leadership. I also became an executive coach, so I sort of really developed this theme. And it culminated in me being the first female, actually, to run RAF officer training, which was a great privilege. And then from there, I moved into being Commandant of the Tedder Academy of Leadership. And I have responsibility for setting the strategic direction for leadership and command across the Air Force. And we're also the headquarters for coaching and mentoring, another area I'm really passionate about.
Great. Thank you so much, Emma, for that introduction. And it's a huge organization, the Royal Air Force, over 30,000 people. What does it mean to be a high-performing team in the Royal Air Force today?
Well, I think obviously it's a great question, and high-performing teams is a phrase that is thrown around a lot. And actually, a lot of people don't take the time to get under the skin and truly understand what it means. But for me, it is actually about results. We're all operating in a very competitive market, a competitive world, and that's no different for the Air Force than any of the other organizations that are out there. The contemporary operating environment within which we're operating is hugely complex. We absolutely have to be performing at our best as a team and achieving those results. But it gets really interesting when you start to look at results, because you have the superficial results, the stuff you can see, the transactional. But actually, high-performing teams have results that go deeper than that. The attraction of people to the organization and the sense of pride that they feel as being a part of it. So in the Air Force, the pride that people feel when they put their uniform on and they feel associated with something that really means a lot to them to be a part of. You retain people, they want to remain being part of this organization. So there's lots of other metrics other than just the surface performance that I think also show a high-performing team.
Yeah, very, very good point. So what are the critical behaviors? What do you see as these critical behaviors and attributes that you're seeing? But also, one of the things I'm very conscious of is that you're going through big change and you're creating the modern Royal Air Force. What are those attributes of a higher performing team in your world?
Yeah, and you're right. We are going through a huge transformation. Again, as I think many organizations across the globe are, there's a lot of strategic trends out there putting pressure on organizations. Everything from technology, the environment, post-COVID workforce expectations. Yeah. We need to transform. We need to change. And you really need high-performing teams to be able to achieve that well, and to manage those complexities and those difficulties in a good way. So I would say you're really trying to create this sense of pride, this sense of loyalty to the organization. And you can't do that by a paycheck. Okay, that runs deeper than that. It's really, really important. I think it's really important to note that genuinely high-performing teams also generate sustained results over a length of time. So any team can be lucky as a one-off, or for a short burst. And perhaps we see this with the stock market. But a truly high-performing team will have sustained results. Okay, it will manage that constant trajectory. There's a mindset involved here. So there's an individual mindset, but there's also an organizational mindset that people buy into. There's something about this element of being together that distinguishes sort of independent peak performance from interdependent peak performance. And for me, this is the real difference between a group of subject matter experts who are individually brilliant and then a team who are actually collectively even better than the sum of those parts. And in terms of then the critical behaviors that really, really help you achieve that, there's this trust, okay? Individuals within that organization need to really believe that they are authentically cared for, that they are part of this group. I think resilience and the ability to bounce back. We talked about sustained results, but no organization is not going to face setbacks, face challenges, face difficulties. But to me, it's how you cope with those. We learn the most when we go through challenge, actually, and we can really push ourselves and try and do things in a different way, look innovatively. And it's really, really important to sort of start to see failure as something we can learn from, something we can progress from and take forward. I like the phrase, fail forward. You know, what are we learning from this? How do we move it? How do we take it to a different place? But to get that environment, you really need psychological safety. And that comes back to this point of trust. And it is absolutely essential. People won't put themselves out on the edge. You know, they won't put themselves out for that incremental difference of performance if they fear that they will be, you know, punished or criticized if they get it wrong. Because if you put yourself on the edge, you know, there is more chance of also getting it wrong, right? You've got to know those parameters. You've got to have that trust and you've got to have that psychological safety. The other really critical point I think is absolutely imperative that we mention here in terms of behaviors is feedback. Now, feedback is a cultural thing. If people get used to it within the culture, it becomes less personal. People are really aware that that's just what you do. You know, high performing teams give feedback and it's a gift. You know, athletes run towards feedback because it helps them get that marginal gain. Well, that's what we need to do too. And the Red Arrows is a great example of this. You know, if you sat in on their debriefs, Andy, you would be, you know, you'd probably be sat in the corner going, oh my goodness, you know, they're harsh. But what's interesting is they're harsh to the role, to the position, to the performance, not to the person. And I think that's a really important delineation.
That's interesting. That was the question I was going to ask you. A few weeks ago, one of your colleagues was a former leader of the Red Arrows, and he was talking about the review process and the feedback process. And it was fascinating that you spend, I think, 30% of the debriefing looking at failure, looking at what could be made better to make sure you don't fail, even in the narrowest margins. So it's fascinating insight. Thanks, Emma.
And I think that delineation between the person and the feedback is also, just to reinforce, absolutely critical. And that's one of the reasons the Reds get teased, actually, because they use their numbers in the debrief. You know, so perhaps Red 1 will say, Red 9, you were out of position, or critique it. But there's a really good reason they do that. It's because it does retain that feedback in the professional area, not the personal. And so it's a little bit like with a child, when you say the behavior's bad, the child isn't. You know, that separation, I think, really helps people to understand and to still leave feeling whole in themselves and to have this desire to improve.
So, Emma, the RAF's a big organization. You've got people who are employed within the service and you've got people who are contracted to the service. How do you create the big picture that they can all buy into?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And we use the term the whole force. And that includes our military personnel, our civil servants, our contractors. And that phrase is really important because it brings us together as one group. And what becomes really apparent then is we're really trying to sell this vision, you know, this sense of purpose. We are in this together. We are a team. And it's this idea of this interlocking with others. So everybody has to know their own individual role. Everybody has to know what they are required to deliver. But if we keep this big picture, we sell this vision and we understand this independence with each other, this intradependency as well as interdependency, you know, it can lead to a really lovely environment, a real I've got your back attitude, you know, almost within the family of support. And I personally think that that's something that the Air Force does very, very well, is creating this family, this team, it's us. It's not me, it's not you, it's us. And let's really have each other's back. And I think that that's really, really critical. And what's another really interesting point is that I think familiarity with your colleagues can really help increase that sense of safety. So really trying to see your work colleagues as people, getting to know them that little bit better, understanding, their background, understanding their personal circumstances where appropriate. It just all really helps to build this sense of seeing each other as individuals and actually really caring. And I think that's something that the Air Force is really trying to do with the whole force.
Yeah. I'm guessing that when you train for big events, you train for things happening. When that training kicks in, when you have to then go to war, for example, I'm guessing teams just click into training. When you're in normal life, and we get events this year like we've had COVID, what happens? What's the difference when you're in waiting state? Do you see things in teams changing?
Yeah, we actually really do. And people will often talk about actually experiencing things very differently on operations to at home. And I think it's because that shared vision, that shared sense of purpose is so clear when you're away, together as a team with a very clear aim. It's much simpler, isn't it? That aim is up front. You know what you're all getting behind. I think when you're in the day job at home and you're just in the office, it's actually a lot easier to lose that sense of purpose, that vision, the why. Why are we here? Why are we doing this? But as far as I'm concerned, really high-performing teams keep underlining that why. They make sure that their employees not only understand it, but they buy into it. And that's where you get the discretionary effort. People know what they're doing and why. In fact, there's something that we use a lot in the Air Force, which is called mission command. And it's actually our underlying leadership philosophy. And what it says is that a leader should really be giving the intent. Okay, and that's the what and the why. And then you leave other people to work out the how, because actually you shouldn't be meddling in the how. Let them come up with it themselves, because they might come up with a really innovative, different way of doing something. But so long as they understand the what and the why and the boundaries of that intent, give them that freedom. So I think that mission and that purpose, you've got to really keep driving it home, even when you're in the more mundane, the more boring areas. It's still really, really important. And I think we see this with teams like, for example, the All Blacks from New Zealand. Obviously we've mentioned the Red Arrows, Apple, Disney. There's lots of these companies, who really keep underpinning this. You can do it through stories. You can do it through narratives. I personally love stories. I think people connect to them. They remember them. Much easier to connect to a story than it is to a vision statement written on a wall. And the Air Force use stories a lot. We tell stories of the people of the Air Force from the past. And actually, by telling them, we reinforce and remind ourselves what behaviors we want. What behaviors do we need in our team to make sure we stay at that top level, at that high performing level?
One of the things I've learned in working with you over the last year or so is that leadership in the RAF is quite pacey. You kind of have 2 years to make your mark, and then you're moved on somewhere else in most instances, as I understand. How do you keep continuity? How do you keep continuity that says when the new leader turns up, the high-performing teams that have made good inroads are suddenly doing something different, or are we doing it the same? How do you cope with that?
So one is the narrative that we've just mentioned and the purpose, because they remain constant. But the other is making sure that they and the mission mean more than the individuals. So you can have a really fantastic top performer, okay, but it can't become all about them. You can't have these hero champions. We see it with change, don't we? You have an absolute champion of change, and they give all their energy. They're incredible. But if that isn't underpinned and embedded truly into the culture of the organization, that person will move on and it will go. It needs to become bigger than the individual. And that's really, really important. And actually, I've got a really great example of that, not actually from the Air Force, but from another area where I was doing some work and I was involved. And there was a top law firm, and one of their top fee earners, and he really was top fee earner. He brought in considerably more than anyone else. But his behaviors were really appalling, really appalling. And I was so pleased to see that actually the organization made the incredibly brave decision of getting rid of this individual. Now, what happened, I think, is so powerful and telling. The profits of the organization actually went up. Now, the reason they went up, despite losing the highest performer, was because of the impact he was having on the rest of the team and suppressing their performance. And that just tells the story, doesn't it? A higher performing team, where they're all performing to the best of their ability, will always outperform even the most genius individual. So I think that's really, really important, that team ethos, that recognizing that the output of the team is more important than one individual.
And Emma, I think that's a great way to sum up what I've heard and what I've experienced with you, talking about high-performing teams. Is there anything else you'd add? Have we missed anything in what you'd like to share around what you're doing in the Royal Air Force?
So there is one, actually, if it's okay. And I'm going to sound a little tough when I say this, actually, but I think actually high-performing teams are also prepared to be a little tough when they want to. We talked about feedback and being prepared to give and receive honest feedback. But I think another really important point is actually taking ownership. And I don't think we do that enough in broader society at the moment, if I'm honest, is taking ownership of situations and owning our part in it. I think it's very easy to blame the conditions and the context. So to say, oh, I'm having a bad day because it's raining, or I'm having a bad day because such and such happened, or this isn't working because of this external inject. Now, all of those things might be real, they might be happening. But I think a high-performing team wouldn't look to those to use those as excuses. They would acknowledge them, they would recognize they were factors, but then they would seek to overcome them. And to me, that's a really, really powerful mindset, that you're not looking for an excuse. You're not being unrealistic, but you're not looking for an excuse. You're owning your part in that journey and what you can do rather than what you can't do.
Very good. Emma, let me thank you very much. And let me also say this as it's an opportunity. When I was with you, it was a huge honor to be with you on Armistice Day at Air Command, talking to your senior leaders with you. And I genuinely, and I want to say it again on behalf of all of us, we thank you and all your colleagues for your service and for keeping us safe. And thanks so much for being with us today. Huge honor, and love working with you. Thank you very much, Emma.
You're welcome, Andy. That's brilliant. And I've, again, really enjoyed it. And final thought, I guess, is just to remind people to remember to lead, not just manage. Remember to lead your people. Don't just manage resources. And I think that's also a key difference. But thank you. It's been really lovely. And I'll speak to you soon.
Thanks, Emma. Thank you very much to all our listeners who joined us today. And if you liked what you heard, please check out our other episodes.
You've been listening to The Mindset Advantage. Follow Arcadia Consulting on social media platforms to stay updated.